Hello, church. I hope you are doing well. If you have your Bibles, turn to Matthew chapter 12. We'll be there in a couple of seconds. We'll be covering verses 1 through verse 14. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that everything's going well and you're part of the woods. I can't wait to see some of you Sunday and that we can finally be together Sunday and be able to worship and sing praises to you and uh, sing praises with you and glorify our God who is in heaven. I think this is going to be a great time. I'm really looking forward to it. It's one of those things that you don't know how much you miss it until you're away from it for a while. And so I'm really excited about that. But let's focus in on our study that we have before us tonight. It's Matthew 12, verses 1 to 14. Just to set the context and just remind everyone where we are. We're in the third section, right in the middle of the book, and we're looking at the types of responses that Jesus has to him. He's already established who he is and what type of people are going to be in this kingdom that he's building. And now we're getting the responses of different people. We've seen the response of John, how he doubted it a little bit, but he received some evidence that this was indeed the Christ, the Messiah, and he took that and he built faith upon that. That's a positive example for us. We saw to the negative side some cities that Jesus directly calls out. And maybe this would be like he calls them out not because they're necessarily antagonistic to him, but maybe because they're neutral to him. They believe in who he is, but they don't want to change their behavior. They don't want to change their life of sin or life of what they want to do. They don't want to give all and become the disciple that he called them to be in, specifically in verses 8 or chapters 8 through 10, that last section that we looked at. And so he says those cities, it's going to be worse for them on the day of judgment than Sodom and Gomorrah, some of the worst people that have ever lived on the face of the earth. And then we have, starting in verse 12, are going to be some really negative responses to Jesus, people who hate him. And these people are the Pharisees. Almost all through chapter 12, we're going to be looking at how Jesus gets along with the Pharisees. And a little spoiler, it does not go well. They do not like him very much. And Jesus challenges him. He does not try to placate them. He does not try to please them. He challenges them, and that kind of builds up some of this conflict, this animosity between the two sides. And so that's what we're going to get into. So let's jump into this. Let's just start with verse 1. Chapter 12, verse 1. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain to eat. Okay, I want you to stop right there. So whenever a section starts off that at that time it was the Sabbath or during the Sabbath or it was Sabbath a day, anything like that, alarm bells should be going off in your brain. This is the way that the Matthew writer, the Mark writer, and the Luke writer basically said something's going to happen. There's going to be conflict. It's kind of when you hear the Jaws theme music in the background. It's like dun 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 dun, like something's happening, or that eerie high-pitched violins. There's tenseness growing. This is the reader's way or the writer's way to letting the reader know that something's about to happen. There's about to be conflict. There's going to be a lot of tension. So when you ever see a section begin with, it was Sabbath, at the time that Jesus went through the grain fields, it was Sabbath, or at that time it was the Sabbath, or it was the Sabbath, anything that should be alarm bells. There's going to be conflict. This is going to be important. And John is going to be, it was night. And John plays on that light and darkness kind of metaphor, day and night. So his will be night. But during Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the Sabbath. It's if you hear the Sabbath, you should start looking for a conflict, some tenseness going on there. Okay, continue on. Verse 2. But when the Pharisee saw it, he said to them, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on a Sabbath." And he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, but only for the priest? Or have you not read how in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had not known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not condemn the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Okay, so the disciples were apparently traveling along, and they were hungry. And so as they go through as they're traveling, they're going through grain fields, and part of what what was allowed by the law was that people who were hungry, who were going through they're passing through, they were allowed to pick a grain and just kind of rub off the outside, the skin of it, and then eat the grain. And that was a way that they could sustain themselves when they didn't have time to make a meal and set aside, like do all the things that it took to make a big meal for themselves. However, the Pharisees did not allow people to do this because on the Sabbath, because that was seen as doing work. The Pharisees, so kind of go back, I've said this a few times before, that the Pharisees are not the kind of Darth Vader evil people that we think of them today. They were instead viewed as the most righteous people, as the people that you should be like, and everyone should be like. They had basically, during the Maccabean period, had taken themselves away from the Sadducees and the chief priests and the temple, because they were corrupt, and they were still corrupt even to this day. And they said, we will not be like them. We will uphold the law of God. And so what they did is they said, we will not even get close to breaking God's law, and so we'll build a hedge of protection around the law. Well, over the years, and not very long after they said they would build this hedge, the difference between their hedge and their gray area and what was against God's law kind of got murky. And basically they allowed their traditions, this hedge, to replace God's law. And they basically said this hedge is God's law. And what we see here is this is a direct tie back to what the end of chapter 11 is about. So if you remember this past Sunday when we talked about Matthew chapter 11, and he talks about, he offers the plea, come to me all who labor and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly at heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And he's directly kind of going after these Pharisees and their hedge. Because with this hedge, they placed a great burden upon the people, a burden that no one can bear. And they put a law of legalism on these people, these Jewish people. And so compared to Jesus's, what Jesus commanded, he commanded such a light burden compared to them. And this is kind of, we get a glimpse of all the stuff that they tried to hold over different people. One was that if you were hungry and there was grain right there, you could not go and get it. Too bad. You have to starve that day until the next day. Those were the kind of rules that they had. And we'll see another one in the next section. But basically, so Jesus answers their accusation in verse 2. It says, look what your disciples are doing. What is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. Again, they took their hedge that God never said you can't eat grain. He said, instead they put what their hedge was, their traditions, and they replaced it with God's. And basically, Jesus gives them 4 reasons why they were wrong, or why they were not right in judging people like this. The first one is in verses 3 and 4. And you have this part of David in which he is, if you want to go look back, I believe it's 1 Samuel chapter 21. He's fleeing from Saul. He's on the run, and he needs some supplies. He didn't have time to orchestrate a big journey. He didn't have time to gather a lot of resources from his house, and he had to just flee. And so he goes to the temple, the house of God, and he asks the priest if they have any bread or any supplies for him. And all they have is the bread of presence, which was supposed to be eaten by the priest and the priest alone. No one else was supposed to eat it. But the priest that was there allowed him and his men that were with him to take that bread with them if they had kept themselves pure and unclean. And so that was technically not lawful for them. And it was, Jesus says that it wasn't. It was not lawful for him to eat, nor was it for those who were with him, but only for the priest. He says that wasn't lawful for him. Now, this is a passage, these two verses, is something I kind of go back and forth with. There's kind of two main views that I think have some credence to them. And I'm not sure which one that Jesus is, I'm not sure which one that, which is right. Which way Jesus is trying to argue it. So one view is that Jesus is saying, hey, look, God never meant for his laws to prevent you from eating food when you're hungry. That was never the intention of the Sabbath. That is not the intention of his rules, is to do that. That was never in the prerogative. Now, that would mean that what David did was okay, that it was against the law, but it was kind of an exception to the rule because of the need and everything else surrounding it. So that's one view. The second view is that what Jesus is saying here is to the Pharisees is, you condemn me for doing something that is, quote, unlawful, even though it's not, and yet you don't accuse David, this man that they greatly revered, of doing something unlawful, even though it's clearly unlawful. They were not supposed to do. So he's basically pointing out that they're a hypocrite. Now, it could be one or the other or both. I'm not totally sure. I'm not sure which argument Jesus was making here. I've went back and forth a number of times over the past several years. But I think that's one of those two is the arguments he's making. The second argument he is making is in verse 5, where have you not read the law and how the Sabbath and the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath are guiltless? So he's basically saying during the Sabbath, the priests are hard at work, and they made sacrifices. They went about all the holy duties that they were supposed to do that day. They were really busy at work. They did a lot of work. But basically, they were held guiltless for that. They were perfectly fine to do that, both to the Pharisees and to the law, to God himself. Neither one accused the priest of violating the Sabbath. And because their service to the temple and their service to the sacrifice is greater than the Sabbath. And so he's saying, if you allow them to do what is good, and to allow them to do their job, which is obviously work, because they are serving the temple. Well, in verse 6, I tell you something, then the temple is here. These men who are picking and grain are serving me, and they're serving me, and I'm greater than the temple. And so it's a argument for the lesser the greater. If that's true for this, that's okay to serve the temple. Then if you serve something greater than the temple, that must be okay too. So that's his second argument. His third argument is in verse 7. For if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not condemn the guiltless. Basically, he says, is you don't understand God, you don't understand the Bible, you don't understand the spirit of the message whatsoever. He goes back and quotes Hosea 6, verse 6. Again, this is the second time. There's a lot of ties back to chapter 9. It'd be good if you could read chapter 9, because there's a lot of tiebacks to his confrontation with the Pharisees there. And he also quotes Hosea 6, verse 6. This is something that they apparently struggled with a lot. And he basically says, you do not understand who God is. You don't understand what the Bible, the rule is. The Sabbath was never meant to be cumbersome upon someone, to restrict someone. The Sabbath was meant for a person to be free from their daily grind and their daily work, so that they have time to rest, the Sabbath rest, and to have time to worship God and build up their relationship with God. But you just made it this suffocating thing. That's why later when he says that the Sabbath was made for man, not the man for the Sabbath. That's what he's saying there, is you've reversed that. And then finally, his fourth argument is for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And I don't think what he's saying here in this fourth argument is saying, well, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, so I can do whatever I want. I can go and do it. If I want to be subservient to it, then I can. If I don't want to, I don't have to. I think what he's saying here is, I'm the creator of the Sabbath. I made the Sabbath, and so I know how it works better than anyone else. I know how it works better than you do. And so I know that this is the way the Sabbath was supposed to be beheld. And so this is a key conflict, tension point between Jesus and these Pharisees. The Sabbath is a key theme throughout the whole Bible, and maybe I probably need to do a lesson on it, just at the Sabbath rest idea. I talked about it a little bit when I went over Genesis 1 and 2 about, I don't know, a couple of months ago, month and a half ago, how the Sabbath rest and is talked about at the end of the Garden of Eden, and then the Israel going to the Promised Land is talked about Sabbath rest. The Sabbath is all through this as a picture all through the Messianic times. And then in Hebrews, it talks about there is a Sabbath rest yet for us, and we're still waiting to reach our Sabbath rest. There's many different types of Sabbath rest, and we're yet to reach ours. There's still a Sabbath rest that remains for us. So that's a big theme throughout the whole Bible. So this is a whole theme, and it's a big conflict point between the Pharisees and Jesus. Now, it's going to escalate in this next section, because look, verse 9, he went in there, and he went from there and entered their synagogue. So they came, he was apparently traveling by, he was outside the city apparently, or something like that. And then they said, why your disciples do what is not lawful and picking grain on a Sabbath. He answers them the 4 reasons why they were lawful, and then goes right to their synagogue. This was their home. This was their home base. He takes the battle right to their place. The synagogue was where the Pharisees had their power. This is where they were spread out. There was a group of Pharisees, usually in each synagogue, especially in the Judea region. And this was their home country. And he goes right up to a man, verse 10, a man that was there with a withered hand, and they ask him, is it lawful to heal on a Sabbath? So they might accuse him. So he goes right up to this man. He sees a man with a withered hand, and they know what he's about to do. They see him go up to this man with a withered hand, and they assume that they see that he's about to heal him. And so they ask him a question: is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So, and then Matthew gives a little narrative section so that they might accuse it, so they might find some kind of fault with them, so that they can maybe bring some kind of discipline upon him. And so this is Jesus' answer again. So they question him again about the Sabbath. So verse 11, and he said to them, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Or how much more of a value is a man than a sheep? So if it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, then he said to him, so let me reread that. Verse 12, of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to him, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. The Pharisees went out and considered against him how to destroy him. And so the Pharisees thought that you could not help another man medically unless it was a life and death situation. Jesus knows this. He's picking a fight is what Jesus is doing, but he's doing it to make a point. He's going to break the bonds the shackles that these Pharisees have held the Jewish people under for a long time now. He's wanting to break those bonds. So he talks about this. He goes right up to this man with the withered hand. It's obviously not a life or death situation, which was the only reason that you could help another man medically. The Pharisees actually said that in some of their manuscripts that you could, like if a building or a tower fell on a man, you could dig out just enough rubble on the Sabbath to see if he was alive or if he would die if you left him in there. And so if he was alive and he was okay and you'd be safe, then you just had to leave him out in there until the next day. These were some of the rules, and that sounds utterly ludicrous to us. But these were the rules that they had set out, and they had put out. And so Jesus is taking it to him. He's trying to show him that this is not how it should be. And so he seeks out a man, in which it's obviously not a life or death situation. And he goes up to the man, and they say, is it lawful to heal on Sabbath? Are you going to do something that's unlawful? And he said to him, he presents another lesser to greater argument. And he says, which one of you who has a sheep and falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out, which is considered work? You're going to reach down and you're going to help this poor sheep out, and you're going to put it back on, which is something that they always allowed, and they all have done. And then he asks a simple question. So if you allow that for a sheep, how much more would you allow that good to be done to another man, a man who knows how long has had a withered hand, a hand that he could have used? And so basically says that the Sabbath was never supposed to outlaw doing good on the Sabbath. Just like it was never meant to outlaw worshiping God or doing anything for his kingdom on the Sabbath. That was never the point of the Sabbath. They turn it into this burden that hangs upon someone. And so he turns to the man and says, stretch out your hand. And the man stretches it out, and it was restored, healthy like that. This is like all the other miracles we've seen. It's immediate, it's total, it's complete. He doesn't have to wait a week. He doesn't have to wait for it to slowly come back, or it's just not quite as good as the other one. It's complete. And that's, again, what it is. But notice the Pharisees' reaction to him. But the Pharisees saw this, and they went out and conspired against him, how he to destroy him. And really, this is the start of him orchestrating his death. Jesus was completely in charge throughout this whole time he was on earth. And right now, he's orchestrating his death. He's using this time in which he is going right at the Pharisees within the synagogue. He dared oppose them, and he healed this man. And they couldn't deny his miracles. And so they went out and destroyed him. And the interesting part is they didn't see it as a way of, well, maybe I should rethink my theology. Maybe my theology is wrong. They didn't consider any of his arguments. They didn't even wonder and say, well, how does he, heal this man who has a withered hand? No one could heal him. No one could do such a thing. Man, this man must have real power. This man must be something special. This must be a prophet, or maybe this Messiah. No, they didn't see in that. The one thing they thought and one thing they saw in that whole thing was, how dare he violate one of our rules? How dare he violate one of our rules? And that is a dangerous place to be in. Because when you're in that place where you care more about your doctrine more than the truth, more than what even your eyes see, more than even the compassion for the man who just got his healed, other people, that is very dangerous because it makes you blind. And you're more concerned about your doctrine than anything else in the world. And it will lead you to a dark place full of hypocrisy and evil thoughts, and not anywhere that is good. And that's where the Pharisees were. And they went and they conspired against him. And that will eventually lead to the point where they will cry for him to be crucified, and they will do everything that they can to get him to be crucified. So that is the first 14 verses of chapter 12. It's a section where you kind of feel the tension building. These are the people who are negative towards Christ, and this is just the beginning. So we'll see some more about the conflict between the Pharisees and the Pharisees and Jesus and his people. Much more in chapter 12. And this is just the start of the story. We'll get much further into it later on. But you see that tension building. You see that all that building. But this is just the beginning. Matthew 12, verses 1 through 14. I hope you have a good day. I hope this was encouraging to you. I hope this is a warning to you not to be like the Pharisees. Always be seekers of the truth. Not to hold on to such a man-made doctrine. Not to hold on to such a doctrine that we create so much that we become blind to the truth. And that's a dangerous place to be. So hope you take that encouragement with you. Hope you look in yourself and make sure you're not that kind of person, because it can happen to anyone. Even inside the church, it can happen to anyone. And so just look in yourself. It's a good time for self-evaluation. But I hope you have a good day, and I hope that you're enjoying the study in Matthew. It's been pretty great for me. I've really enjoyed it. Hope you have a good day.